Welcome, Bill. This is Nadeem Haq. Um, we are welcoming Bill Easterly here. Bill Easterly, as you know, is the author of many books. He is one of the best researchers on development aid as well as growth economics. He's done a number of things. In the World Bank, he did something on fiscal sustainability, one of the original people working on fiscal sustainability. He's done a lot of work on growth economics, but most recently, he's been publishing on aid. He's written 2 or 3 excellent books. The Elusive Quest for Growth comes to mind. Secondly, he's been writing very critically about expert opinion in economics. So his famous book, Tyranny of Experts, is there. Today we have Bill joining us from New York, and I hope he'll give us another wonderful lecture. He's done that before as well in the last meeting too, I think. So we really welcome Bill Easterly to talk about paternalism versus self-determination in economic development. Bill, we've been talking about this all day. The World Bank people were here too, and we've discussed ideas as to whether who should lead growth, the World Bank or us? What is the role of donors versus local people? And this is a subject that's very close to your heart. So I won't say much on this except to give you the floor, and I hope you'll give us some time to ask questions. So over to you, Bill. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nadeem. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to talk about something very different from what we are all used to as development economists. I want to talk about how development economists have begun to discover a demand for what we could call most exactly a demand for agency. So the idea is that there's not only a demand for material GDP, as we are used to, there's not only a demand for material consumption, but there's also a non-material demand for agency. So here's a quote from Banerjee and Duflo: "The extreme poor are robbed of their dignity and their agency." And Banerjee and Duflo have written about what kinds of policies could result in poor people getting.
Can you get closer to the mic because your voice is a little muffled?
Oh, okay. Let me talk a little bit louder. Is that better?
That's much better. Thanks.
Okay. So the basic idea that is emerging in development economists today, but it's also been around for a long time, is again that there's a demand for a non-material demand for agency and not just a demand for material consumption. Now, there's a lot of resistance to this, and I confess I've been resisting to it for a long time. Is agency just a meaningless buzzword? Does it just lead to other buzzwords, of which we have an oversupply in development, like empowerment, community-driven development, partnerships, consulting civil society and stakeholders? It's not clear that this really affects how development is really done. And what I want to suggest is we can use as an experiment to think about agency. We can use the historical cases where people saw themselves as worse off from a loss of agency, even in cases where their income might have increased. And these will be counterexamples to material income being a sufficient condition for human well-being. Now, this colonial history doesn't automatically lead to some kind of tarnishing of today's development efforts. It's not that we don't want to kind of give in to cheap, empty rhetoric like neo-colonialism in development. It's more like there are options in today's development to be paternalistic and non-paternalistic. And colonial history gives us kind of an insight to what it looks like to be paternalistic and what the alternative could be. So when I say history, I'm going to go back a very long way. Go back 4 centuries to John Winthrop, who is the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629, the initial wave of colonization of North America. He gave, what is important here is he gave a rationale of material development for the colonization, that he thought God had not intended this whole continent to lie waste, and he saw it as lying waste because he saw the local inhabitants had not enclosed any land, they didn't have any settled habitation, they didn't have tame cattle. And so he suggested that because of this, there was a mandate for Europeans to come develop the land. And this was going to be a rationale for colonization, and it would remain a rationale for colonization for centuries after this. So this is important because we can see colonization as one big experiment that is claiming to offer material progress to the colonial subjects while taking away their agency. So John Winthrop argued that this development they were bringing was going to benefit the Indians in North America. They will learn from us to improve a part of their land to more use than they could have done with the whole of their land. And this makes it possible for the Europeans to take some of their land because the remaining land would allegedly yield them more benefit than all the land that the Europeans had taken away from them. So this is this idea that you could give material progress while taking away the agency, the property rights, the self-determination of Indians. And note also the use of two words that are extremely important in the debate on paternalism for many centuries and still today is this we and they, that we are doing the development to them. Development is something that we do to them. And John Winthrop even had this seal drawn up for the Massachusetts Bay Colony that had this picture of an Indian saying, "Come over and help us." It saw colonization as happening as kind of philanthropic development. Now, did John Winthrop's promise that the U.S. would be developed as a result of European settlement, did that come true? Well, yes, it did in a very dramatic way. Here's the dramatic increases in a very crude measure of U.S. per capita income from 1650 till the present, and there's the explosion of per capita income that we're all very, very familiar with. Going from 1,000 almost to 64,000, 64-fold doubling, tripling, doubling, quadrupling over and over again till spectacular rise in development is achieved. And if we think about the development of the Native Americans in the US, also we have a number that would be very high today. It would be the red bar in this graph. It would be 30% lower than the average US per capita income. And we don't know exactly what it was 4 centuries earlier, but it was probably around the same ballpark as the US per capita income 4 centuries earlier. So there's also been this dramatic expansion of Native American per capita income. So is that enough to infer that John Winthrop's promise was correct as far as material income? That seems to be true. Is it also true that there was a welfare improvement for Native Americans? That is much more controversial. So this is a typical example of a big issue that we still struggle with today in development. How to think about whether development is a good thing when development happens with major human rights violations. So the human rights violations in that period are very well known. We can make them very concrete, and this helps us make the idea of agency very concrete. That Winthrop, the English, are offering development by taking away agency. And by taking away agency, we meant an example like this, where a few years after Winthrop, the English went to war with the Pequot tribe that were resisting the whole land for development deal. The English attacked a Pequot village and massacred most of the inhabitants, including 150 women and children. The English sold the Pequot survivors into slavery. They gave the remaining Pequots to other Indian tribes and said they shall no more be even called Pequots. So this kind of dramatic example gives us an idea of what agency really means. It's not at all a buzzword. For the Pequots, this was not some vague buzzword were they offered being community-driven development? No, this is critical agency that obviously they had a very high demand for agency and had a big loss for that to be taken away. So what we see here is this issue of defining development when there are these huge rights violations. And this is not just a scientific debate. In fact, it's not really a scientific debate at all. it's the point that development cannot be reduced to this technocratic illusion, that material poverty is just something that can be solved by the experts, that we do to them, that we solve it by technical and scientific means without having a debate on these other demands, these non-material demands, these valuations attached to dignity and agency. So let's keep going with this Indian development example. 2 centuries later, the development is still being offered to the Indians. And here's a Cherokee preacher in 1825 who seemed to be describing this Indian development as actually a success. So he pointed out the Cherokees were produced in the midst of the European settlers. The Cherokees were producing Indian corn, cotton, tobacco, wheat, oats, indigo, apples, peach orchards. Industry is extending itself in every part. It seems like development is a success, but not so fast, because Brown laments the way that Indians had not consented to having their land taken away for this kind of development. They had not consented to giving up their agency. So the same Cherokee preacher said that Indians have been driven from their lawful possessions by called the English usurpers. He records a non-material reaction, an indignation. And then he says, even though there had been this big increase in material development for the Cherokees, it did not compensate for the loss of agency. But he said, better it would have been had the native never even seen the shadow of a white man. And he was writing at a time when the Cherokees were being stripped of even more land and being forced to emigrate to west of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. He said the Georgians never would have consented to this. Why? The Georgians have agency. Why don't you let us have agency on whether we want to give up our land or not? So this is important because there's this long history we have in development that is very much neglected, that development has not only been about material gains, development has been about a group of liberal reformers that have been fighting against denial of agency. They were fighting in the 1820s and 1830s as Brown was writing against the Indian removal, and they have continued to fight ever since. So we can think of the way Brown resolved the puzzle of defining development is that what does agency mean? Agency means you have a right to consent to your own progress. You have a right to not have someone else define what is progress for you. That the developers must be constrained by the consent of those they claim to be developing. The debate is about a demand for agency. Again, it's not a scientific debate. There should be a scientific debate. All of that should continue. It's great, but it's not only about that. Now, there's big disadvantages about having this about shifting the debate in this way. And I have to admit, I'm worried about a lot of them trying to have a debate on agency. It keeps seeming very non-concrete, or it's so much easier to do the material well-being. It's so much easier to do the science and not the political and ideological and moral debate about recognizing agency. And you don't want to have this kind of moral debate in which one side says to the other, you are immoral, and I'm going to win the argument by claiming you are immoral, and I'm morally superior. No, that doesn't work. There's no way to force anyone else to have moral values. It's just recognizing the fact that a lot of economists over time have argued for these values, and it's something we do need to discuss and evaluate. So the economists that can talk about agency start with Adam Smith, which Adam Smith is not very well known as an anti-colonial critic criticizing paternalism. He portrayed how the conquest of North America had involved the savage injustice of the Europeans and had been destructive to those unfortunate countries. And he lamented that there could have been an alternative, and this is really the crucial point today. The demand for agency can be satisfied with something that's very familiar to economists, and this is trade instead of aid. Smith said there could have been exchanges that were voluntary on both sides, which would have led mutual gains from trade, that this would have proved as advantageous to the new world as it did to the old world. So Smith he certainly did not use the modern language about agency, but you see in his writings this idea coming out of agency very, very clearly. We can think of this as first the idea of consent, that there's someone is offering you a bargain, that is offering you a trade, is offering you a voluntary exchange. Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. So this is an exchange that makes it possible to have agency on both sides. And second, that there's recognition of the right to self-determination, that every man is recommended to his own care. It is right that it should be so. So Adam Smith is saying agency is an end in itself. It's right that there should be agency. And lastly, that there's equality. Every man is perfectly free to pursue his own interests in his own way in the market of trade and exchanges. That there's no way. Sorry, that my dog is in the background. Every man is perfectly free. So there's this universal equality of people's right to participate in exchanges. There's no we and they. There's no one side of the exchange is we and the other side is they. It's like there's never any we doing anything to them. It's always, each of us interact with each other in equality and each realize our gains from trade with each other. And Smith was very overt in criticizing paternalism. He criticized the idea of experts, that we experts were supposedly eager to promote the happiness of our fellow creatures, but we lacked any reliable feeling of what they either suffer or enjoy. We lack adequate knowledge of what other people want, and that's why paternalism is not a good thing for human well-being. He criticized this sort of delusion, this hubris of experts. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit. So the problem with paternalism is there's bad incentives and inadequate knowledge. There's bad incentives because we have this big temptation to act in our own interests when we are put in charge. There's inadequate knowledge because we don't really know what other people want. Now, what's fascinating about this is Adam Smith actually saw colonialism passing away at some date in the future. That he had this remarkable prophecy, which we're going to see is partly come true, that the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world could arrive at some equality, that they would reject the injustice of independent nations. The independent nations would move into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. And then he tied this specifically to commerce, that this equality would come about precisely through an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries. So it's, again, trade instead of aid. So this is a big split in the 18th century Enlightenment that is still with us today, this split between paternalism and self-determination. Paternalism leads to coercion. Self-determination is the idea of consent. Paternalism is this idea that the West has the right to conquer, to develop the rest. The self-determination strain of the Enlightenment sees an equality of rights. Now, it's not so simple. It's just saying paternalism is always wrong. No society says zero coercion. There's the optimal amount of paternalism and coercion is not zero. It's greater than zero. So paternalists can, in some circumstances, be right, and that's what makes the debate more complex. But clearly, the critique is that paternalism very often goes too far, and we want to understand what it looks like to go too far. So the key point here is that commerce, trade between individuals, trade between nations, is a way from both sides to have agency. And this enabled the liberal development thinkers in the past couple of centuries and decades to play a key role in achieving major benefits for human progress. The debates on Indian removal, which are what today we would call ethnic cleansing, the fight for the abolition of slavery, the fight against all forms of forced labor in colonialism, and colonialism itself, of course. So another big episode for this debate is the debate over slavery in the U.S., the slave owners claimed that slavery actually raises the material income of slaves compared to, say, those who were still in Africa, or compared to, say, the white working class at the time in the US and UK. And of course, there would be a lot of skepticism about whether that claim is true. And obviously, the slave owners are very self-interested in making that claim. It certainly helps to have, cartoon villains when you're having a debate on agency. But the crucial point is actually not about whether the slave owners were empirically correct that income had increased with slavery. And some non-self-interested economists over time have argued that was true. Adam Smith thought it was true. Economic historian Robert Fogel thought it was, when he was writing the book Time on the Cross with Stanley Engerman. He claimed that material income of slaves was comparing favorably to that of the white working class at the time. That's just an empirical conclusion. So even if it's empirically correct, that doesn't resolve the question. Here's a great counterexample in which obviously enslaved people demanded not only income, they demanded freedom, they demanded agency. And so this is another great counterexample that it shows us material income is not enough, that there is this non-material demand for agency. And Frederick Douglass, the most famous advocate, someone who had escaped from slavery himself, is the most famous critic of paternalism in the midst of slavery. He even was worried about the paternalism that would happen even after the emancipation of the slaves. And he has this sort of shocking phrase that what is the optimal policy for the ex-slaves? What would it be? His answer was do nothing. Mind your own business, let them mind theirs. It's not that Douglass was going to reject all aid to the ex-slaves after emancipation, but for him, the paternalistic aid was worse than doing nothing. So he states over and over again this demand for self-determination. He says, us ex-slaves, we only ask to be allowed to do with ourselves what we want. We want a free labor market that allows us to work with our own hands, to eat our own bread. That's the self-determination demand that Douglass was seeing. If you see Black Americans wanting to purchase land, let him alone. Let a Black American purchase it. If you see him on his way to work, let him alone. Let him work. Don't have discrimination at work. This is kind of the self-determination with the market, participation in free markets for land, labor. This is the alternative. And also the demand for political rights. If you see a Black American with a ballot, let him alone, let him choose. His right of choice deserves as much respect and aid and protection as your own, addressing white Americans. So he sees Black Americans as having a demand for agency that, of course, involves emancipation from slavery, participation in free markets, participation in democracy, and asserting democratic self-determination of Blacks. And the record of paternalism of whites towards Black Americans had just been, for Douglass, just an excuse to deprive us of rights, he said. Rights that you would never have tolerated being taken away from you. So this, again, Douglass is very clear on the evils of paternalism without consent, paternalism through violence and coercion. And also the kind of image of Black Americans that involved in the sort of philanthropic efforts to kind of save the ex-slaves after emancipation led to this violation of dignity that was associated with denial of agency. If you put things in terms of white Americans saving Black Americans, led to this image that Frederick Douglass found created a lot of revulsion in him. This is sort of what today we would call poverty porn, that portrays poor people in this sort of undignified way that violates dignity. So Douglass hated this image of the prostrate form, the cringing attitude, the suppliant outstretched hand of beggary. He said, we will not consent to be in that position. He will not consent to be the patronized by aid givers. So is this demand for agency, is this a real thing that leads to real things happening? Well, of course it is. It led to the defeat of slavery. It led to the passage of the 15th Amendment that gave blacks the right to vote. Again, dignity and agency, we see with the help of historical examiners, are not buzzwords. These are real gigantic changes in human progress. So I can just keep going all day long with over and over again. There's this paternalistic justification of colonialism. King Leopold in 1876 portrayed development policy towards Africa as opening to civilization Africa. This led to the colonial powers at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85 partitioning Africa in the name of increasing the material well-being of the native populations. But of course, what actually happened with Leopold's Congo is that King Leopold's forces killed millions of Congolese, forcing Congolese labor to engage in forced labor at the point of a gun, to gather rubber in the late 19th and early 20th century, confiscating land, banning free trade. And the big human rights movement against this promoted specifically free trade, free labor, free land rights. And this kind of liberal critique of colonialism continues over and over. So there's this sort of forgotten tradition of liberal development economists criticizing colonialism in the name of criticizing paternalism and criticizing the denial of agency. William Graham Sumner is an American economist in 1898, criticizing the American colonization of the Philippines. He's an heir to Adam Smith, and this idea that what he criticizes is this attitude that we know what is good for you better than you know yourself, and we're going to make you do it. This fatal combination of paternalism and coercion. So I'll skip over some of these slides. Just again and again, colonialism is justified in the name of development and with its paternalistic image. In 1919, after World War I, colonialism and the Versailles Treaty after World War I was again continued and justified as supposedly leading to the well-being and development of peoples supposedly done by the colonial powers. And the liberal economists kept trying to critique this in the name of the Adam Smith tradition of trade instead of aid. The famous free market economist Ludwig von Mises in 1927 criticized this claim of colonialists that they could pretend that they are acting selflessly in the interest of others. He said this is nonsense. The goal must be the complete liberation of the colonies from the despotic rule under which they live today. And when finally the colonialism started to lose the battle, it was because in statements like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, that we see this sort of demand for agency start to triumph, this demand for consent, self-determination, equality, this idea that what led to this kind of huge increase in human welfare was not about economists advising about material income only. It was not only about that. It was also about the values that men are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So we can think of the big picture now, looking back, as a sort of the big picture is usually, of course, there's this big rise in development, material indicators, GDP per capita, fall in material poverty rates. Those are all wonderful, great things and should continue to be celebrated. But there's another big wave of human progress that should also be celebrated, that Adam Smith's prophecy did come partially true, that there was a big change over time in the world, replacing conquest with commerce, replacing coercion with consent, replacing paternalism with self-determination. So you can argue that the biggest change between the West and the rest is not about material development, it's about this change from conquest to commerce. So here the graph shows, the green line shows the number of slaves being traded in the slave trade, and then the slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1808 with the advocacy of liberal economists. Then we see slavery in the US, the number of slaves in the yellow line, increasing and increasing, and then abruptly falling to zero with emancipation. After that, we still see another wave of colonization. The share of territories in Asia and Africa that are colonized was continuing to increase. In the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, and then it too goes to zero. And then replacing all of that is the red line exports from Asia and Africa engaged in free trade instead of aid lead to this kind of wholesale replacement of coercion with consent. So the lesson is that agency in history has been very far from being a meaningless buzzword. And the point is material progress has not been enough. Obviously, it matters hugely for human welfare, but it's not enough to define well-being. So now let's jump to the aid world of today. Do developers today respect the agency of the poor? Well, there's still a problem. It's not as bad as it was during colonial era, but there's still a problem that aid financed autocrats after the end of colonialism were replacing the colonial autocrats. They were denying political and economic freedom, often justifying this themselves in the name of material development. And the development world did, after the end of colonialism and still today, concentrate almost entirely on material poverty, not upon the demand for agency, not upon the rights of the poor. The one part of the modern kind of intellectual causes that seems to be the heir to the liberal reformers of Adam Smith and his heirs might be the modern movement on human rights. But human rights were treated as a completely separate topic from development, not part of how development is defined. And so moving to the 21st century, we see continuing this trend of just support, a lot of support for autocrats that seems to reflect this kind of illusion that development can be done in this technocratic way and yet neglecting the rights of the poor. So this table shows what's kind of a remarkable number about recent aid efforts is that the aid increases in the new millennium in annual aid. There was for the least free fourth of aid recipients. That is the 25% of the world's countries with the most, according to institutional ratings by the World Bank and others, are in the least free fourth, meaning denial of political and economic freedom. And that the aid to those countries in that category has increased 300% in the new millennium. It's a remarkable number. While all the other aid recipients had a 35% increase. Well, probably the reason why this was happening is because the US and UK kind of themselves had a lot of control over aid, and they were fighting the war on terror during these years, and they wanted aid to go to their allies in the war on terror. This is not military aid, this is development aid. But still, they wanted to give development aid to their allies, and the allies were often the most autocratic and the least free countries in the world. Has forced labor completely disappeared after this long campaign against forced labor and slavery? Here's the share of countries according to one agency rating forced labor over a long period of time. The share of countries in which forced labor is absent, is virtually non-existent, doesn't exist at all anymore. What's kind of startling, yes, there has been an increase in the share of countries in which there's complete absence of forced labor, but it's still a number that's below 40% of countries, and it's actually declined recently. So forced labor is far from being just a curiosity that we only talk about in colonial times. It's still a big issue with us today. Is ethnic cleansing still a big issue? Well, of course it is. So the kind of ethnic cleansing that Adam Smith and his heirs were criticizing, the ethnic cleansing of Indians in the US, today we see something still going on. 47 states as of 2006 were engaged in violent coercion of 72 ethnic groups around the world that account for 577 million people. Coercion, and the well-known examples include groups like the Darfuris, the Uyghurs, the Rohingya, Tutsis. These states engaged in ethnic cleansing received $55 billion in foreign aid in 2006. The debate on paternalism and aid continues. We see a big debate happening on pictures in aid, which seem like a really kind of trivial marginal cause, but are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. saying there's still this debate on paternalism going on. So here's an image of an NGO put up after the Haiti earthquake in 2010. And this image is a lot like sort of John Winthrop's image of the Indian saying, come over and help us. Here it is a picture of a Haitian woman just sort of with the outstretched hand begging for aid. It's the same kind of picture, the same image that Frederick Douglass didn't like for aid to ex-slaves. And also the agencies, 21 of 25 agencies, Haiti Appeals, used images of children, which is another kind of big obvious indicator of a paternalistic approach, that there's sort of the West saving the children of the rest. And so there's been this sort of fierce reaction to this kind of imagery. There's a couple of development consultants here, Marie-Rose Ramon-Murphy from Haiti and Digan Ali from Somalia, sort of issued these very strong statements just expressing extreme discontent with these paternalistic images. They want to immediately seize marketing people as passive beneficiaries of aid who need these white saviors. Amartya Sen himself has kind of like been one of the great spokesmen for this idea of agency or freedom. And his great book, Development as Freedom, is kind of continuing this Adam Smith tradition of calling for the ability of people to be recognized for their self-respect. You don't want to deny recognizing people as poor. You don't want to deny them self-respect. You don't want to see them as like patients. Responsible adults must be in charge of their own well-being. So Amartya Sen again reiterates this long demand for self-determination and development, and not only just material development. And Sen says, you know, what's been going on that is sad from Sen's point of view is that economics does focus only on the material incomes, the incomes and the wealth, and neglects the value of freedoms, neglects this demand for freedom, this demand for agency. And this doesn't automatically lead to a claim for, you know, doing laissez-faire and trade and free markets necessarily, but neglecting this role of freedom leads us to not appreciate enough the role of the market mechanism. The market mechanism is not only about making possible material benefits, it's also about making possible the mutual demands for agency in a way that leads all sides to be better off. So maybe now should we just think of some trade-off between poverty relief and the goal of self-determination and choose a point on this trade-off? But that doesn't quite get it right either. There's still some deeper issues. Who should choose the point on the trade-off? And so the demand for agency is sort of like even more deeper than that. That recognizing the demand for agency also recognizes the agency of people to say how much they want agency. And sort of liberal democracy and individual freedom is a way for people to collectively and individually choose for themselves. And this also is getting better with the fulfillment of Adam Smith's prophecy. Not, you know, a long way from the triumph of these values, but sort of getting better over time. The red area here is the decline in the most extreme form of autocracy in the 20th century and 21st century. The blue line is the classification of countries as liberal democracies, which has been growing over time, but still very far from making enough progress. And there's a lot of countries that are in the middle between extreme autocracy and liberal democracies. Also, economic freedom has also been increasing over time. The share of countries with the sort of lowest levels of economic freedom, which are actually around where France, Sweden, and the UK were in the 1950s. That sort of level of economic freedom was sort of universally common in the world in the 50s through the 80s. Then in the 90s, there's this big decrease in those countries that have the worst levels of economic freedom. The share of countries with that very low level of economic freedom has decreased dramatically in the new millennium, beginning in the 90s and the new millennium. So we see this movement again towards replacing aid with trade. And in Africa, which we think of as the region sort of most dependent on aid, this explosion of trade instead of aid has been actually also very successful in Africa. So if we add together sort of market-based flows like remittances from migrants, foreign direct investment, exports from Africa, the sum of those categories is 5 times larger than official development assistance received by Africa. So it's not true that the primary relationship between Africans and the West is one of charity. Instead, it really is one of consensual exchanges in markets. And lastly, even the Sustainable Development Goals that seem almost entirely about material goals for development, even the Sustainable Development Goals recognize this right for each country a primary responsibility for its own economic and social development, recognizing a demand for self-determination that is a goal in itself. Now, it's not so easy that that's the end of the story and utopia has been achieved. No, not at all. And in fact, not all of the ways of demanding self-determination are necessarily consistent with each other. There could be a collective demand for self-determination that resorts to coercion of individuals. So there could be a conflict between individual demand for self-determination and the collective demand. It's not easy. It's complex. But what we really see from this history and state of things today is that there really is this non-material demand for self-determination. There really is a non-material demand for agency. And it has to be addressed by development. And development cannot only be about material relief from material poverty. So the key point is, yes, there has been a lot of progress on the right to consent to your own development for agency and self-determination, but there still needs to be a lot more. And if I was trying to think of a line that I could give those who are campaigning for agency, that would be a lot more eloquent than these buzzwords about consulting civil society and empowerment and blah, blah, blah. I think I would paraphrase. I would suggest that these advocates use a more eloquent phrases for agency, quoting and modifying a famous quote from Abraham Lincoln at the time of emancipation, that we here highly resolve that development shall have a new birth of freedom, and that development of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Thank you very much.
Very nice, Bill. Thank you very much. It's very thought-provoking, wonderful, and really hits a nerve here. You're absolutely right about agency. That's what we feel the need for, and you're absolutely right about fighting paternalism. But I was just thinking about it while you were speaking that a number of things come to mind. For example, take Argentina, the recent election. It almost seems as if Argentina is giving up agency. I mean, they're thinking of adopting the US dollar. They're thinking of, kind of the new contender, I forget his name, trying to shrink the government and give in to, external market forces. Now, I think in one sense you would say, well, that's the right thing to do because, quite frankly, they're giving into market forces. In another sense, they're giving up agency. But related to that also is the issue of resources. I mean, poor countries are sitting on a large amount of resources that is needed for development. So there is a struggle for resources. And yes, of course, the West, which needs all the rare earth and technological resources, lithium, etc., they're going to fight for it. And they set up narratives to be able to do it. But then, of course, we've also developed the whole paraphernalia of international aid, to which both you and I belong, the World Bank, the IMF, etc. And there are well-meaning people there. We know all of them. They're well-meaning people. They don't have the paternalistic approach, etc. But yet the international bureaucracy now has placed itself in a position of saying that they have the responsibility for the global poor. As Paul Collier says, he speaks the bottom billion. So there are all kinds of trends floating about here. How do you think of an Argentinian or a Pakistani? How do we navigate these waters? How do we claim agency? And even if you want to claim agency, how can we claim agency in this globalized world where there's so much happening? And I think, quite frankly, I find it very hard to navigate these waters because we are inundated with events and things that are happening and the struggle between, let's say, the US and China. So do we have any agency left anymore, or how would you navigate these waters?
Yeah, I'm glad those are really great questions and comments, and Nadim. I think the complicated thing again is that there are kind of multiple dimensions of the demand for agency, and not all of them are necessarily compatible with each other. That makes it, again, is another reason why agency is not just sort of this simplistic slogan. We just go rah, 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 give everyone agency, and that's the end of the story. It's more like, well, you don't want to have coercion and paternalism and forcing another country like Argentina to adopt sort of free market policies. That should be up to Argentines themselves to make that choice, to have agency to make that choice in a collective political way. And yet, if they do kind of go for the most extreme forms of government control over markets, that's going to lead to violations of individual agency. And of course, the liberals, probably most liberal economists, probably most of all want to campaign most for individual agency, and maybe are not as enthusiastic about collective demand for agency, political self-determination of whether there's free market policies. The point is that coercion is not the answer. Paternalism and coercion are not the answer, even though there might be a bad outcome if Argentina chooses a heavy degree of government regulation. There's sort of no way out of that except by just continuing to leave it up to Argentines themselves to make those choices. Coercion would not help them. Coercion in the name of giving consent to individuals through markets is not going to help. And I think you also make a good point that aid is well-meaning. It's not intentional demand of violation of agency. And I think I could have maybe stressed more during the colonial part of the history that colonialists were also often well-meaning. Obviously, a lot of them were self-interested and corrupt and had kind of bad intentions towards colonial peoples. But there were always a lot of sincere people who thought that all of this paternalism was actually going to lead to good things happening. And there were some altruistic motives, and if anything, that makes the problem of paternalism even more severe. That the sort of good people often do endorse paternalism.
In this day and age, where now we've got two dominant powers, U.S. and China, and we've got a dollarized world, and as you well know, the dollar is dominant, and the international payment system works the way it works. Does scale matter? Does a small country like Pakistan, or even smaller, let's say something like Malaysia, or even Thailand, or Benin, do they have the choice of currency, for example, or do we just all have to accept the US currency and thus give up part of our sovereignty or agency, and have to follow certain rules, FATF and various international rules, which are all set? In fact, we can't even have a say in those rules because we just don't have the ability to be able to set those rules. Those rules are set by global experts who are way beyond our competence. So does that also not eat into our agency?
Yeah, so how does one react to that problem of being sort of a small country in a globalized world? I mean, the most extreme possible reaction could be like that of Eritrea, where you just, go to sort of completely closing off aid, completely shutting down the relationship with the rest of the world. And that's an extremely extreme reaction to try to assert some kind of sovereignty and self-determination. I think most nations around the world do not find that extreme attractive. And so, is there some intermediate way to resolve that demand? And I think one thing people talk a lot about is that there could be a lot bigger role for sort of the global South in making these rules of international trade and commerce and finance. That's maybe one way to go to hope for that, although that also is extremely difficult. That we don't see rich, powerful countries probably likely to give up their own control over those rules.
Let me throw the floor open so that more people can ask questions. Folks, any questions you have? Go ahead, quickly, raise your hands. And
Professor Easterly, this conversation on what you call paternalism and agency was very enlightening. I was just wondering whether you have also touched on, from this angle of paternalism versus agency, on international migration. And what do I mean by that? Of course, Adam Smith was really a good predictor that commerce would eventually weaken paternalism, and there'll be a revival of agency automatically through commerce. But what about international migration? What about how does that fit into this paternalism and what you call this about what you call agency, individual agency? Would you have any comments on that? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great issue to bring up in this context. You could think of migration as just like, sort of like a demand for free trade and labor services, that you allow people in the destination country to choose to consume foreign labor services. You allow the origin people in the origin country to offer labor services to the destination country. And you could think of the same argument for that as you have for trade, that it makes possible sort of mutual gains, mutual agency on both sides, mutual dignity. Of course, things are not quite that easy because a lot of countries are resisting migration for other reasons. They might have concerns about sort of the cultural effects of migration, that they seem to have some demand for kind of national identity that they might feel is violated by free migration. So that's another example of a very complex issue in which there seems like an easy way to have agency, but it's not so easy because there's also agency by the rich country voters who are resisting migration.
Professor, thank you very much. Very insightful talk as always. Do you think that the earlier it was basically colonialism, maybe based on countries, but now we have the global north actually pushing their policies towards the global south? We had the example of the WTO. We have the conventions on climate change. Even the development framework such as SDGs may not be very conducive for the domestic policy making. We have other tax laws coming up, such as the base erosion and profit sharing laws. So how do you comment that how developing countries, even like Pakistan's case, they can avoid such paternalism or losing away their agency basically when such a kind of an environment is basically put to them, which they cannot avoid or live without it, since it's the world in which we have to live, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I might be somewhat reluctant to give too much importance to the agency is it sort of makes the world a sort of harder place to solve than the material income view of development would have been. If it was only the easy thing, I would just do some, have some cash grants that improve material consumption. That seems like an easy thing to resolve. But talking about the issues you're talking about, even the kind of imposition of rules for commerce and trade and tax policy and so on that you're talking about imposition by the global north is itself a problem and violates the demand for self-determination and countries at the mercy of these rules. So at least what we can do is kind of point out that this is not just some technocratic issue of the optimal rules for international engagement for trade and finance and tax policy and so on. This is not something that's just about, achieving the best technical solution for global material development. This is about, accommodating demands for self-determination, which then would lead to some resistance of the global north imposing the rules and some maybe positive benefit of having the global south have much more of a role in forming these rules.
Thank you, Professor. I think it was an excellent presentation. You have discussed through the history of agency and paternalism, but even in the 21st century, as we speak, we see this kind of agency and paternalism even exists today in developing countries as well as particularly in Africa. We have seen that the colonization of entire African continent continued, and now there is a realization in Africa that this is not going to work. So we have witnessed 8 coups in 3 years in many African countries, and you can see the resentment of agency. Agency can be in a different shape. Agency and paternalism in Africa is now the people have reacted to this. Similarly, in developing countries like Argentina, Pakistan, and many other countries, we are being forced to implement new liberal economic order. This is another kind of agency implementing as a parentalism or forcing developing countries like Argentina, you gave the example, Pakistan, and many other developing countries who are still under agencies and implementing such policies which are not at all consistent with their requirements. So your opinion on this?
Great, thank you. That's an excellent comment and question. It's so hard to resolve these demands for self-determination. So if you can tell that I, as an economist, I like the sort of more market-oriented policies promoting more free trade, free flows of capital. But does that give me the right to force my views on anyone else? Does that give economists from the North some right to violate the agency of other societies to choose their own attitudes and policies towards on the question of government intervention versus free market policies? No, it doesn't. So I think the liberal economists have not done a very good job on this, and sort of recognize, when we think of like the Washington Consensus as sort of embodying liberal economic ideas, that was something that was forced on developing countries by the U.S. and U.K. and World Bank and IMF and so on. So that does not lead to, if anything, that sets back the cause that I believe in of kind of promoting more free market policies to make individual agency more possible. That cause is set back by forcing those free market policies on other countries. So I do not think that's a way to go about it.
In closing, Bill, let me just ask you a bit of a far out question. Let's throw technology into the game now. As you can see, technology is setting up, artificial intelligence coming in, robotics coming on, 3D printing, etc., etc. I don't need to tell you all that, it's all there. Now, what is with the data as a new oil, etc., everything is going towards Google, Facebook, etc., the innovative companies, which are largely located in the US or some in Europe and some in China. So in a sense, we are all going to be left out of this revolution. We are still chasing textiles, we are still chasing footwear, and unfortunately, we may not be able to keep up in the race. And migration is also, doors are being closed on us. But this also raises another issue with technology coming in and income inequality, or the share of resources being so unequally distributed. But then there is also the daunting factor of UBI. If all this happens, the science fiction happens, what happens to our teeming millions, the Arthurian world that we live in, where we've got huge amounts of surplus labor? Do you have a vision for that? How would you react to that?
Yeah, that's a great issue. I mean, it makes me think of a couple of papers I was teaching and having students discuss in my PhD development class recently, which were making the point that technology is something that is really spread a lot through trade, actually, that technology spreads by being embodied in inputs that are imported by countries, and then by importing those goods, the technologies are adopted. So, for example, the Green Revolution, agricultural technologies that led to improved seed varieties, those could be imported by just importing the seeds. And similarly, something like agricultural technology based on fertilizer can be adopted just by importing fertilizer, importing better and better fertilizers over time. So trade is a way to spread technology that Adam Smith would certainly have not been surprised by. So I think that's another case for kind of like more agency through trade and markets for people in the developing countries, firms and agents in developing countries to control their own technology adoption.
Or in another setting, Bill, let me also ask you, since we are speculating a little bit, how do you see the future of higher education and university in this kind of setting? Because we are again in this world, in our part of the world, we are rushing to set up new universities. We are rushing to try and catch up with you. But yet I see the university kind of being disrupted in the West. So what is the role of education now in the coming world?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I suspect you have a better answer than I do from what you just said. So I actually would turn it back to you, and I want to hear more about what you think about that question. I guess it's just one issue coming up a lot now in U.S. universities is the kind of liberal ideas of free speech and free debate that are being threatened by some more illiberal movements that want to suppress kind of thoughts and people's thoughts that are not acceptable to some other group, kind of using coercion as a replacement of free speech. That's a big problem now, and I hope that problem is not going to be as severe in new universities in developing countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. I must admit that, I've known you for 50 years almost, and I think you're one of the most creative thinkers of our generation. You always come up with something new. Today you've come up with Winthrop and Douglass and so many new nuances on your on development and development themes. And I think you have always given us the best you can. From our point of view, Bill, you stand out as one of the best development economists that we met. And I know you've been to Pakistan many times, but I would like to invite you once again, if you have the time, come and visit us. Come and see us in person and come and see the country that you saw years before. Okay. Thanks a lot, Bill. Thanks again. We'll bother you again for some future lecture. Thank you. Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.